They say a mother's love is unconditional until the day her own child changes the locks. I spent 40 years building a home, brick by brick, filling it with birthdays, laughter, and Sunday dinners. But one by one, the things I loved vanished. My old rocking chair, my kitchen curtains, even my name on the deed. And then, with a polite smile, my son's wife told me I didn't fit the energy of the house anymore. That afternoon, I found myself standing outside, key useless in my hand, staring at the life I had built from the wrong side of the door. They thought I'd stay quiet. They thought I'd fade away. They forgot something. Everything I gave them came with one thing they could never take: my will to rise again. When Ethan called that rainy Tuesday evening, his voice carried a weariness I hadn't heard since he was a teenager fighting the flu. He said things had been tight lately, that he and Laura were thinking about coming back home for a while, just until they got back on their feet. I didn't hesitate. I told him the upstairs guest room was ready, that I'd make his favorite chicken stew. After all, what mother wouldn't open her doors to her only son? When their car pulled into the driveway a week later, the sight of them stepping out together, Ethan in his navy jacket, Laura balancing a paper cup of coffee, warmed something deep inside me. I thought about how quiet the house had been these past years, how the air had grown still since Henry passed. Maybe this was what I needed. A full house again, laughter, footsteps in the hall. At first, everything was almost as I imagined. Laura complimented my cooking. Ethan lingered at the table after dinner, and I went to bed each night with the comfort of knowing they were just down the hall. But the shifts began small, almost invisible if you weren't looking closely. One morning, my old kitchen radio was gone from its usual spot on the counter. In its place sat a sleek black speaker, the kind you talk to instead of tune. "It'll make things easier," Laura said with a bright smile, tapping its surface like it was a pet. I smiled back, though I missed the static crackle of my morning news. A week later, the floral curtains I'd sewn myself vanished from the kitchen windows. Laura said they clashed with the light, airy vibe she envisioned. She replaced them with thin beige panels that reminded me of waiting rooms. I told myself not to fuss. Curtains were just curtains. The real jolt came when Laura asked if I'd be willing to move my things into the smaller back bedroom. She needed the guest suite, she explained, for her new remote consulting work. "It's just temporary," she added, as if that softened the blow. The back room was fine enough, but the walls were thin, and the sunlight never quite reached it. I told myself it was no trouble. Family makes sacrifices. Over the next few weeks, the house began to feel less like my own and more like something I was borrowing. My recliner, the one Henry and I had bought with our first tax refund, disappeared into the garage. In its place, Laura set a narrow, stiff-backed chair to open up the space. The living room smelled faintly of her lavender diffuser instead of the apple tarts I like to bake on Sundays. Still, I held my tongue. I told myself this was what it meant to share a home. That change was part of life. I busied myself in the garden, trimmed the roses, polished Henry's old tools in the shed. If I kept to my corners, I wouldn't feel the edges closing in. One evening, as we set the table for dinner, Laura mentioned in her lilting, almost sweet tone that I'd left water rings on the counter again. She turned to Ethan and said, "Maybe it was time to think about spaces that better fit Maggie's energy and needs." She didn't look at me when she said it, and Ethan didn't look up from the iced tea he was pouring. The mashed potato bowl in my hands felt suddenly heavier. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed in the back room, staring at the curling wallpaper I'd chosen decades ago. I thought about all the memories layered into these walls, the nights I stayed up with Ethan when he had croup, the mornings Henry and I danced barefoot in the kitchen just because. Now those memories felt like antiques no one wanted on display. I told myself I was overreacting. People redecorate all the time. Families adapt. But there was a gnawing in my chest I couldn't name. The next morning, I baked an apple tart, the kind Ethan loved as a boy, and left it on the counter with a note, "Take to work. Love, Mom." I wanted to believe small kindnesses could turn the tide. When I returned from the garden later that afternoon, the tart was gone, but so was the note. The kitchen smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the maple trees, I stood in the hallway listening to Laura hum in the living room. The air felt different, like a guest room that had been turned over for the next occupant before you'd even packed your bags. I told myself to be patient. After all, this was my family. I didn't know then just how far patience would have to stretch, or how much it would cost me in the end. The first few weeks had the kind of warmth I thought would last forever. One evening, we all sat around the dining table. Me at the head, Ethan on my right, Laura across from him, and the clink of silverware mixed with bursts of laughter. I had made pot roast, mashed potatoes, and my mother's cornbread recipe, the same spread I'd served at family gatherings for decades. Ethan told a story from his high school baseball days. Laura laughed until she wiped her eyes, and for a moment, I thought, this is what a home should feel like. But warmth can hide the first shivers. The next morning, my kitchen felt off. My old radio, the one with the faded dial I'd twisted through countless storms and quiet Sunday mornings, was missing. In its place was a glossy black speaker. "It's smart," Laura said when I asked. "You can just talk to it, more efficient." She gave me a smile that made me feel foolish for missing a thing as simple as static between stations. A few days later, I noticed the floral curtains I had sewn myself were gone, replaced by sheer beige panels that barely softened the light. "The old ones were too busy," Laura explained as she adjusted the folds. "These are more modern." I nodded, though my hands itched to smooth the familiar fabric that was now nowhere in sight. Then came the recliner. My recliner. The one Henry had surprised me with after my first year at the hospital. I walked into the living room to find it missing, replaced by a stiff, angular chair that looked more like art than furniture. "The other one made the room feel crowded," Laura said, arranging throw pillows with quick, precise hands. "This one opens up the space." I didn't tell her that the room had felt open enough before, when it still felt like mine. The real shift came on a Friday afternoon. I returned from the grocery store to find Laura in the hallway, holding a box of my photo albums. "Oh, Maggie, I hope you don't mind," she began in that careful tone people use when they've already made a decision. "I thought you could move into the back bedroom. It'll be quieter for you, and I can set up my office in here. Just temporary." The back bedroom was smaller, darker, with one narrow window that looked out onto the side fence. I swallowed the lump in my throat and told her it was fine. Family makes sacrifices. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being shifted, like a piece of furniture being pushed just out of the way. That Sunday, we had guests, friends of Ethan's from college. Laura served wine, Ethan manned the grill outside, and I floated between the kitchen and the patio, making sure everyone had what they needed. At one point, Laura, laughing with a glass in her hand, gestured toward me and said, "Oh, that's just our live-in tenant who doesn't pay rent." The words slid out of her mouth, light as air, but they landed in my chest like stone. The group chuckled politely, unsure if it was a joke. I forced a smile, excused myself to the kitchen, and busied my hands with a stack of clean dishes that didn't need cleaning. The laughter from the patio drifted in, but it sounded different now, muffled, distant, like I was hearing it through a wall. That night, as I lay in the narrow bed in the back room, I stared at the ceiling and tried to convince myself she hadn't meant it. People make clumsy jokes all the time. Maybe it was harmless. But cracks have a way of widening once you notice them. The following week, I was passing through the hallway when I heard low voices from the living room. I paused just out of sight. Ethan's voice, steady, measured, was saying something about getting the paperwork started before the end of the month. Laura's reply was quieter. "We'll need to transfer the deed first. It has to be in our name." A cold ripple slid down my spine. I stepped back, my heart tapping hard against my ribs. For a moment, I was sure I'd misheard. Of course I'd misheard. Ethan would never... I shook the thought away, forcing myself to believe it was about something else. Maybe a car title. Maybe a bank form. Anything but the house. Still, when I passed Ethan in the kitchen later, I studied his face for some sign, some crack in the easy smile he gave me. There was nothing. That night, I sat at the kitchen table long after everyone had gone to bed, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. I told myself that families' weather changes, that patience was a kind of love, but somewhere deep down, I felt the first true flicker of doubt. It began with a piece of paper. One morning, Laura approached me in the kitchen holding a neatly printed sheet. She smiled as if she were offering me a new recipe. "I thought we could make things easier for everyone," she said. The title read, Shared Living Guidelines. I skimmed down the list. Kitchen must be cleaned immediately after every use. No personal items in the living room. No strong scents in shared spaces. Laundry room off limits during business hours. Every single guideline was about something I did, things I'd been doing in my own home for decades. I glanced up, but Laura's expression was pure politeness, her tone sugar over steel. "It's just so we can all live more smoothly," she added. Ethan was at the table with his laptop. He didn't look up, didn't say a word. I nodded, folded the paper, and placed it in the drawer where I kept warranty manuals and old coupons. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away, but I knew it wasn't a compromise. It was a boundary, drawn around me. The changes seeped in slowly after that, like water under a door. I stopped watching the evening news in the living room because Laura said she worked better in quiet. I moved my knitting basket upstairs because she said it cluttered the space. Even the smell of my coffee brewing in the morning seemed to wrinkle her nose. One afternoon, I came in from the garden, hands still smelling faintly of rosemary, and found the sliding glass door locked. I tried the handle twice, thinking maybe it had jammed, but it was firmly shut. The curtains inside were drawn, and no one came when I knocked. I circled to the front and tried my key in the door. It didn't turn. My own house and my key no longer fit. The late afternoon sun was hot on my neck. I knocked again, harder this time. No answer. My phone was inside on the counter, and I wasn't about to go banging on the neighbors' doors like a lost child. So I sat on the front steps, gloves still in my hand, and waited. I told myself it was a mistake. Maybe they'd gone for a walk. Maybe something had jammed in the lock. The minutes stretched, shadows growing longer on the driveway. Nearly 2 hours later, Ethan pulled in, his car rumbling into the garage. He looked startled to see me on the steps. "Oh, Mom, sorry about that. Laura must have locked up for security." He said it lightly, like I'd been inconvenienced by a slow traffic light, not shut out of my own home. When he let me in, the air inside felt cooler than it should have, like a room that's been sealed off too long. I placed my gloves on the counter, forcing a smile I didn't feel, and went straight to the back bedroom. That night, I lay awake listening to the low murmur of their voices in the living room. I couldn't hear the words, only the tone. Laura's clipped, Ethan's muted. It sounded like planning. I thought about the guidelines in the drawer, about the way my key had failed in the lock, and felt something sharp and quiet in my chest. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was the beginning of knowing I didn't belong here anymore. That Friday, I decided to try something I hadn't done in weeks, extend an olive branch. I remembered Laura once mentioning she loved chicken piccata, so I pulled out Henry's old skillet and spent the afternoon slicing lemons, pounding chicken breasts, and letting the kitchen fill with the smell of butter and capers. When she came in from her home office, I set the plates down at the table. "I thought you might like this," I said. Her face lit up in that quick, bright way that never quite reached her eyes. "Oh, Maggie, thank you. This is so thoughtful." For a fleeting moment, I believed it. We'd barely finished eating when she reached into her tote bag and pulled out a folder. "While we're all here," she began, glancing at Ethan, "I thought it would be good to formalize some boundaries for our shared spaces." Inside was a printed document titled Mutual Living Agreement. Each bullet point was a rule. No use of the laundry room before 6 p.m. No personal photos in common areas. Kitchen counters must remain clear and uncluttered at all times. One section even restricted excessive use of electrical appliances after 9 p.m. I set my fork down. "This is thorough," I said. "It's just to make things smoother for everyone," Laura replied, her voice sugar-coated but firm. Ethan didn't say a word. He just sipped his water and stared at the table. The next day, I spent the morning pruning roses and raking the last of the autumn leaves from the yard. The air had a sharp bite to it, and my fingers were numb by the time I made my way to the back porch. When I tried the sliding door, it didn't budge. Locked. I tapped on the glass. No answer. Through the sheer curtain, I could make out shapes. Laura on the sofa, Ethan leaning against the doorway, both laughing at something on her phone. The laughter twisted inside me. I tapped again, harder this time. Laura glanced toward the door but didn't move. I walked to the front, tried my key. It stuck, then turned halfway before catching. I knocked, once, twice. The cold seeped into my coat, into my bones. My breath fogged the air in front of me. 30 minutes passed, then 40. I stood there, gloves in hand, watching my own reflection in the glass like a ghost that couldn't cross a threshold. Finally, Ethan opened the door. "Sorry, Mom, we didn't hear you," he said. His tone was light, but his eyes slid away from mine. That night, I was still chilled long after I'd come in. I made tea, carried it to my room, and found a small stack of mail on my bed. Laura must have helpfully brought it in. The top envelope bore my bank's logo. I slid it open absently, expecting a statement. Instead, the words leapt off the page. Notice of account closure. My savings account, one I'd kept since Henry passed, where every overtime shift, every careful budget had quietly added up, was gone. The letter stated it had been consolidated into a new account under a different name. My hands shook. I sat down on the edge of the bed, reading it again to be sure. It was real. The account number, the closing balance. All correct. The air seemed to thin. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. I thought of the years I'd guarded that money, not for extravagance, but for security, for the what-if moments in life you hoped never came. And now, it was gone. For a long while, I couldn't move. The paper lay in my lap, heavy as stone. Then as I reached for the drawer of my nightstand to put the letter away, I found something else. A thin manila envelope, its flap worn soft from years of handling. It was Henry's handwriting on the front. Inside, a single page, his will in its original draft. I had filed the legal version long ago, but this was his own words, unfiltered by lawyers. At the bottom, in the firm, steady script I knew better than my own, he had written, "If anything happens to me, the house belongs to Maggie. Always. No exceptions." The rush of relief was so sudden it almost made me dizzy. The account might be gone. The warmth of my home might be slipping through my fingers. But here, in black ink, was proof of something they could not erase. I pressed the page to my chest and closed my eyes. For the first time in weeks, I felt the smallest pulse of strength returning. Not because the fight was over, but because I now had something worth fighting with. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table long after my tea had gone cold. The letter from the bank lay open beside me, its words still pressing into my chest like a bruise that refused to fade. I thought about calling Ethan directly, demanding an explanation. But I could already picture the conversation, his careful pauses, his vague reassurances, the way his voice would soften just enough to sound reasonable while giving me nothing. Instead, I reached for the phone and dialed a different number, Clara Morgan. I'd known her since she was a teenager, the daughter of my late friend Rose. She had grown into a sharp-minded attorney specializing in elder rights, someone who knew the law but also knew me. When she picked up, her voice was warm. "Maggie, it's been too long." "I need your help," I said simply. There was a pause on the other end, then a quiet, "I'll be there this afternoon." True to her word, Clara arrived just after 2, a leather satchel over her shoulder and a notepad in her hand. She didn't waste time with small talk. She sat at the table, met my eyes, and said, "Tell me everything from the beginning." I laid it all out, the guidelines Laura had handed me, the locks, the bank letter. As I spoke, Clara's pen moved quickly, her brow furrowing deeper with each detail. When I finished, she leaned back. Maggie, what you're describing isn't just bad manners or family tension. It's a pattern. Isolation, control of resources, changes to property titles. These are red flags. I slid the manila envelope across the table, the one with Henry's original will. Clara read the line about the house twice, then gave a short nod. This is important. It's not legally binding the way the filed will is, but it's strong evidence of intent, and intent matters. She pulled out her laptop, fingers flying over the keys. I'm going to start with your bank accounts. We'll get the statements for the last 12 months and see where the money went. An hour later, Clara's expression had shifted from concern to something harder. She turned the screen toward me. Here, see these? Transfers just under $10,000 each, spaced about 3 weeks apart. That's deliberate. Small enough to avoid automatic reporting, but consistent enough to be a pattern. I stared at the rows of numbers, the dates lining up like a trail of breadcrumbs I hadn't noticed before. All of them, Clara continued, went into an account under the name Lewis Holdings Trust, registered just 4 months ago. Trustee Ethan Lewis. My stomach nodded. Ethan, my Ethan? She nodded. Do you recognize the trust? I shook my head. I've never even heard of it. Clara jotted down the registration number. That's not all. I'm going to pull property records next. If they've done anything with your house, it'll be here. While she worked, I sat there feeling the edges of my world shift. The kitchen felt smaller, the walls closer. I thought of Ethan as a boy, building forts in the living room, begging for one more bedtime story. I tried to picture that boy at a bank counter, signing papers to move his mother's savings into his own trust, and my mind refused to fit the pieces together. Got it, Clara said finally. She turned the laptop again. On the screen was a county property record. My house, listed under Lewis Holdings Trust, filed just 6 weeks ago. Next to grantor's signature was my name, scrawled in a way that looked almost right, but not quite. That's not my signature, I said. My voice was calm, but my hands had gone cold. I didn't think so, Clara replied. We'll need a handwriting expert and we'll need to talk to the notary listed here. But Maggie, this is serious. This isn't just family trouble. This is fraud. I took a slow breath. What do we do next? We move quietly, Clara said. If they realize you're onto them, they could drain accounts or transfer assets before we can freeze anything. I'll file an initial inquiry with the bank and the county clerk's office, and I want you to gather anything you have. Old bank statements, the filed will, any correspondence about the house. As she packed up her satchel, I felt the smallest flicker of something I hadn't in weeks. Momentum. The kind that comes when you stop absorbing blows and start stepping forward. After she left, I sat in the fading afternoon light. Henry's will still on the table. Outside, I could hear the faint hum of Laura's voice through her office window. Somewhere in the house, Ethan's footsteps moved down the hall. I didn't confront them, not yet. Let them think I was still the quiet, accommodating presence they could manage. But now I had Clara, and Clara had a plan. The next morning, Clara called me before I had even finished my first cup of tea. Her tone was brisk, but I could hear a spark of energy behind it. Maggie, I dug deeper last night. You'd better sit down. I did, clutching the mug like an anchor. Besides the trust, she continued, there's something else. A life insurance policy. Opened 3 months ago. Beneficiary, Ethan Lewis. Policy value, $500,000. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and foreign. Life insurance on me? Yes, Clara said. And Maggie, the application includes your signature, only... She hesitated, and I could feel the pause like a hand on my shoulder. It's not yours. Same imitation we saw on the deed transfer. They didn't even bother to get the slant right this time. I felt a shiver creep up my spine, cold and sharp. It wasn't just about taking what I had built. It was planning for what I might one day leave behind. And not naturally, a whisper in my mind added before I pushed it away. "Can you prove it?" I asked. "We already can," Clara replied. "And I have more. Late last night, I subpoenaed the trust's account activity. There's a cash withdrawal from 2 weeks ago, $4,800, from an ATM on Pine Street. And guess what?" Her voice shifted, carrying the smallest trace of grim satisfaction. "The ATM had a camera." Within an hour, Clara was at my kitchen table again, laptop open. She clicked play, and there he was, Ethan. Gray hoodie pulled low, shoulders hunched, sliding the card in and pulling out stacks of bills. The timestamp matched the withdrawal on the trust statement exactly. I stared at the frozen image when Clara paused the footage. My son's profile, clear as day, lit by the cold glow of the machine. There was no mistaking him. "He can't talk his way out of this," Clara said quietly, "not with this kind of evidence." For a long moment, I couldn't speak. There was anger, yes, but it was threaded through with something heavier. Grief for the boy I used to know, the one who used to scrape his knees in the yard and run to me for comfort. "What do we do now?" I asked finally. "We go to court," she said. "Today. We file an emergency injunction to freeze every asset tied to the Lewis Holdings Trust and the life insurance policy. That stops them from moving anything while we build the fraud case." The certainty in her voice was like a rope in a storm. I nodded. "Let's do it." By late afternoon, Clara had drafted the motion, attaching the forged documents, the will, the bank statements, and, most damning, the ATM footage. As I signed my own affidavit, my pen didn't shake. For the first time, I felt the balance shift ever so slightly. She left for the courthouse just as the sun dipped low, promising to call as soon as the clerk filed the papers. I stood by the window, watching the driveway where Ethan's car usually sat. It was empty. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. Then my phone buzzed. A text. No name, just a local number I didn't recognize. The message was short. "If you keep going, you'll lose more than a house." My fingers tightened around the phone. I read it twice, 3 times, searching for some hint of doubt. But there was none. For a moment, the fear rose, hot and sudden. Then it cooled into something else. They still thought fear would stop me. They didn't understand fear had already burned away. I saved the message, forwarded it to Clara, and locked my phone. Outside, the first stars were appearing, small but steady against the night. They had crossed every line. Now I was crossing back. The courthouse was smaller than I remembered, just a modest brick building tucked between a post office and a bank. But as I stepped out of Clara's car, it felt like walking into a stadium. My palms were dry, my shoulders squared. I had been here once before, years ago, to finalize Henry's will. That day, Ethan had walked beside me. Today, he was on the other side. Clara led the way up the stone steps, a leather folder in her arm. She was all business, her heels clicking in a steady rhythm. "Remember," she said quietly, "we're here for facts, not feelings. You answer only what's asked, nothing more." I nodded, though my stomach was already tightening. Inside, the courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and coffee. A long table on each side divided the space, and in the middle sat the judge, gray-haired, glasses perched on the end of his nose, eyes already scanning the docket. Ethan and Laura were already there. Laura wore a pale blazer, her hair twisted into an immaculate knot. She looked up briefly when we entered, then bent to whisper something to their lawyer. Ethan didn't look at me at all. When our case was called, Clara stood. Her voice was calm but carried to every corner of the room. She presented the emergency motion first. The forged deed transfer, the bank statements, the trust records, the life insurance file, and finally, the ATM footage. When the video clip played, the silence was heavy. On the screen, Ethan's profile was unmistakable, his hand feeding the card into the machine. Laura's lips pressed thin, but she didn't turn toward him. Clara laid out the request simply: freeze all assets tied to the Lewis Holdings Trust and the contested insurance policy, initiate forensic analysis of the signatures on file, and prohibit any further changes to the estate until the investigation concluded. Their lawyer stood and tried to smile. He called it a misunderstanding, a matter of family finances poorly communicated. He said the trust had been formed to protect Maggie's interests, that Ethan had been acting under a perceived authority, and that the life insurance was a well-intentioned safeguard. But when the judge asked directly about the signature on the insurance file, the lawyer hesitated. "My clients are not handwriting experts," he said carefully. The judge's gaze shifted to Laura. "Mrs. Lewis, did you personally witness the signing of this document?" Laura's fingers curled around the edge of the table. "I assumed Ethan handled it." The pause that followed was deliberate. The judge wrote something on his pad, then turned back to Clara. "The motion is granted in full," he said. "Assets are frozen. Forensic review of all contested documents will be conducted by the court's independent expert. I will expect a preliminary report before the next hearing." The gavel came down with a single solid strike. For a heartbeat, I just sat there, the words echoing in my mind. Motion granted. Assets frozen. It wasn't the end, but it was a foothold. Ethan shifted in his seat. He still didn't look at me, but his jaw was tight, the muscle there twitching like he was grinding his teeth. Laura leaned close to him, her lips moving quickly. He didn't answer. As the judge moved on to the next case, Clara gathered her files with efficient movements. "That's the first wall," she murmured to me. "Now we build the rest." We walked out into the sunlight, the cool autumn air hitting my face. On the courthouse steps, I caught a glimpse of Laura's reflection in the glass doors. Her expression was smooth, but her hands were clenched at her sides. Ethan followed her down the steps a few paces behind. For the first time in months, I didn't feel smaller when he passed me. If anything, I felt taller. Clara stopped at the bottom of the stairs and turned to me. "You did well in there," she said. You stayed steady. That matters." I looked back at the courthouse doors. Inside, the wheels were turning now, slow, deliberate, but turning all the same. And for the first time, they weren't moving against me. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, the frost just beginning to trace the window panes. The fear was still there. It would be for a while. But underneath it was something I hadn't felt in months: momentum. They had tried to erase me. Today proved I could still write my own name. The morning of the second hearing, I stood in front of the mirror for longer than I needed to. The pale blue blouse hung neatly on my shoulders, the same one Henry once said brought out the color in my eyes. I hadn't worn it in years, not since his retirement dinner. It wasn't about nostalgia. It was about walking into that courtroom as myself, not the shadow they wanted me to be. Clara picked me up just after 8. She didn't waste time with small talk. She knew I was keeping my energy tight. As we walked up the courthouse steps, the autumn sun was bright, but the air had that sharp bite that hinted at winter. Inside, the judge's bench looked exactly as it had last time, but the tension felt heavier. Ethan sat to one side, eyes fixed on the table in front of him. Laura was next to him, posture straight, her hands folded so tightly her knuckles were pale. When the judge called our case, Clara rose with her usual composure. She began by introducing new evidence, a notarized affidavit from Henry's former estate lawyer, confirming that Henry had made it clear, verbally and in early drafts, that the house was to remain mine for life. Then Clara held up a sheet of paper. "Your Honor, this is a note in Henry Lewis's own handwriting dated 2 months before his passing. It reads, 'If anything happens to me, Maggie keeps the house. Non-negotiable.'" Her voice didn't tremble, but mine did inside. I hadn't heard those words aloud in years. The courtroom was still. The judge nodded, making a note. Then his eyes moved to Laura. "Mrs. Lewis, I have one question for you. Who signed the deed transfer to the Lewis Holdings Trust?" Laura's breath caught, just enough for me to see. I assumed Ethan... She started, then stopped, glancing sideways at him. Ethan's head snapped toward her. "Laura," he muttered under his breath, but the microphone caught it. "Mrs. Lewis," the judge said evenly, "you will answer directly." Laura swallowed. "I didn't see it happen. I believed Ethan managed it." The room shifted. It was small, but the ripple was there, an invisible wave of surprise that she had, even slightly, turned the light toward him. Clara didn't move, but I could feel her mind sharpening like a blade. The judge leaned back, tapping his pen. "Given the evidence presented, financial records, ATM footage, sworn affidavits, and now the absence of a credible witness to the signing, I am ruling the deed transfer invalid due to probable forgery." His voice didn't rise, but each word landed like a gavel strike. "The property is to be restored to Margaret Lewis's sole ownership. Additionally, the court will refer this matter to the district attorney for criminal investigation into possible fraud and forgery." For a moment, I didn't breathe. It was as if the air itself had thickened, holding me in place. Across the room, Laura's perfect posture faltered, just slightly. Ethan's jaw clenched hard enough I thought he might crack a tooth. Clara's hand touched my arm under the table, a quick grounding gesture, but my eyes stayed on the judge. This wasn't just a freeze order now, it was a turning point. When we left the courthouse, the reporters were waiting. 2 local stations, one from the regional paper. Clara spoke for us, calm and measured, while I stood just to her side. I didn't want the spotlight. I just wanted the truth to keep moving forward. The drive home was quiet, save for the low hum of the heater. Clara reminded me the investigation would be slow and that the DA's office might reach out for a formal statement. I nodded, still half in the courtroom, hearing the words over and over, restored to sole ownership, criminal investigation. When she dropped me off, the afternoon light was low, washing the street in gold. My key turned easily in the lock, but the moment I stepped inside, something felt off. The air wasn't right. The air. I walked through the hallway slowly. A chair in the living room had been pushed slightly out of place. The edge of a dresser drawer upstairs was left open an inch. In my bedroom, the quilt was folded back, not the way I'd left it. On the desk, the stack of documents I'd been keeping in a sealed folder was spread out in a loose fan. Someone had been here. I checked the back door, locked. Windows, too. No signs of a break-in, which meant whoever it was had a key or knew how to get in without leaving a trace. I sat on the edge of the bed, the blue blouse now feeling like thin armor. The victory at court still glowed faintly in my chest, but it was cooling fast, replaced by that old, creeping unease. This fight wasn't over. They had lost a battle, yes, but I could feel it in the disturbed air of my room. They weren't finished with me yet. The morning after the ruling, I woke to the sound of wind threading through the trees outside. For the first time in months, the knot in my chest wasn't quite as tight. The house was mine again, at least on paper. But standing in the kitchen with my hands wrapped around a mug of tea, I realized something important. Owning it wasn't the same as belonging in it. I walked from room to room. The walls were still painted in the sage green Henry and I had chosen together, but now they felt foreign. Laura's fingerprints were everywhere. Brass handles on the cabinets, cold light fixtures, photographs with my face cropped out or replaced entirely. The air smelled faintly of her perfume, as if she had tried to erase me with scent alone. I didn't touch anything that morning. I just let my eyes move over it all, absorbing the truth. I had fought for this house, but I didn't want to live in their shadow anymore. By midday, Clara arrived with a thick envelope. "It's official," she said, placing it on the table. "Title retransferred. Sole ownership. Your name only." Her smile was small but genuine. I opened the envelope, ran my fingers over the crisp paper, and felt still, not triumphant, just still. "Clara," I said quietly, I don't want this to just sit in my name until I die. I want it to mean something, something better than what they tried to make it. She tilted her head, listening. I want to transfer it into a trust, I continued, for women like me. Women who've been pushed out of their homes by family or circumstance, a place to land until they can stand again. Her eyes lit the way they did when a case turned in her favor. We can set that up. A charitable trust, irrevocable if you want it protected permanently. Permanently, I said without hesitation, and I don't want Ethan or Laura's names anywhere near it. We spent the afternoon at her office drafting documents. The language was precise. The Margaret Lewis Foundation for Transitional Housing. Assets included my house, an old rental cabin I'd recovered during the investigation, and the investment dividends Henry had left me. The trust would be overseen by a board of women with experience in housing advocacy. When Clara slid the final draft toward me, I signed it without looking back. The pen moved smoothly across the page, no tremor in my hand. That night, I began packing. Not because I was being forced out this time, but because I had chosen to leave. I boxed up only what mattered. The rocking chair from the sunroom, the bird feeder from the back porch, Henry's photograph holding Ethan as a boy before the world complicated them both. The next morning, I stood in the backyard with my tea, watching the leaves rustle in the wind. The light hit the porch just right, casting long golden lines across the grass. I breathed it in, my last morning here as a resident, and felt no regret. Moving day came quietly. I had found a small cottage on the edge of town, 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, and a view of the forest. It wasn't large, but it was mine, entirely mine. No one could tell me where I could sit, what I could hang on the walls, or whether my curtains were too loud. By evening, I sat on the new porch, the sun dipping low, the blue shawl Henry had given me wrapped around my shoulders. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. It was the kind of peace you can't buy. It's earned. Clara called to check in. You settling in okay? I am, I said, my voice steady. Better than okay. And Clara, thank you for all of it. This was you, Maggie, she said. I just handed you the tools. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet a while longer, listening to the forest. For months, my life had been defined by battles, every day a fight to prove I existed. But now, the silence wasn't hostile. It was sanctuary. And somewhere deep down, I knew this was my real victory. Not the court ruling, not the title in my name, but the fact that I had chosen my own next chapter, on my terms. The foundation's paperwork would be filed in the morning, and with it, the house that had been my prison and my battlefield would become someone else's refuge. That, I thought, was the best kind of justice. The morning sun lay soft across the garden, painting the rose bushes in pale gold. I stood on the porch with my tea, tracing every curve of the backyard in my memory. The twisted apple tree Henry had planted, the stone path we laid by hand, the patch of daisies that stubbornly bloomed every spring no matter how harsh the winter. I let myself savor it, knowing this would be the last time I saw it from this vantage point. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. That's why the cream-colored envelope in my mailbox felt so out of place. No return address, just my name in looping handwriting I recognized instantly, Laura's. I carried it inside, set it on the kitchen counter, and stared at it for a long moment before breaking the seal. Inside was a single sheet, thick paper, neatly typed, with one short message at the bottom in Laura's hand. Let's talk like family. The letter was an invitation to dinner. Private room, upscale restaurant downtown. On the surface, it read like an olive branch. But I'd learned enough to know that when Laura reached out, it wasn't about reconciliation. It was about control. Still, I accepted. Not out of hope, but curiosity. 2 nights later, I walked into the restaurant wearing black slacks, a pale blouse, and no jewelry. Neither submissive nor defensive, just steady. Owen stood as I approached, forcing a thin smile. Laura didn't. She sipped her water, eyes cool and calculating. We went through the motions at first, small talk about the weather, how busy they'd been. Then Laura leaned forward, folding her manicured hands. "We've been thinking," she began, "and we believe it would be better for everyone if the house was transferred to us officially, for the sake of family harmony." I didn't move, didn't blink. "In return," she continued, "we'd consider adding your name to a joint investment account. That way you'd still benefit." For a long moment, the only sound was the faint clink of silverware from another table. I let the silence grow thick. Then slowly, I smiled. Not warmly, but with the calm precision of someone holding the last card in the deck. "That's an interesting proposal," I said, "but you're a little late." Both their heads tilted slightly. "The house is no longer mine to give," I continued. "It belongs to the Margaret Lewis Foundation for Transitional Housing, an irrevocable trust. Your names aren't on it, and they never will be." Laura blinked once, twice. The confident tilt of her chin faltered. Owen's gaze dropped to the table, his jaw tightening. "And as for that investment account you mentioned," I added, "Clara has already reviewed the withdrawals under expired power of attorney. That's a legal matter now." For the first time since I'd known her, Laura had nothing to say. She stared at me, lips parted but silent, as if her script had been ripped from her hands. I stood, smoothing the front of my blouse. "This dinner may not be over for you," I said quietly, "but my part in it is." I walked out without looking back, feeling the cool night air wrap around me like armor. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. There was nothing left to pack. The movers had already taken the last boxes to my new cottage. I made tea, drank it slowly, and walked through the house one last time. In the hallway, a framed family photo caught my eye. Ethan as a boy on Henry's shoulders, all sunlight and laughter. My own face had been cropped from the print, replaced with a neutral background. I let it hang there. In my bedroom, the faded quilt I'd made decades ago was folded neatly on the bed. I ran my hand over its worn fabric, then turned toward the door. By noon, I stood on the porch with the keys in my hand. I locked the door once firmly and placed the keys in an envelope for the foundation's administrator. The air was crisp, smelling faintly of rain on concrete. I didn't glance back. Not at the apple tree, not at the stone path, not even at the daisies. The past was behind that door, and I had no interest in visiting it again. When I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, the radio crackled to life with an old song Henry used to hum. For a moment, my throat tightened, but then I let the melody fade into the background. This wasn't an ending. It was the quiet ripple after a stone drops into deep water, unseen but powerful. And as I drove toward my new home, I knew those ripples would keep moving outward, far beyond this house, far beyond me. I had left not just a place, but an entire chapter of my life behind, and I'd done it standing tall. The cottage was nothing grand. 2 bedrooms, a narrow galley kitchen, and a small porch that looked out toward a stretch of pine forest, but it was mine. The first night I slept there, I left the window cracked open and let the scent of damp earth and pine needles drift in. It was a far cry from the sprawling house I'd once fought to keep, but it felt honest. Every wall was free from judgment, every room silent in a way that didn't make me feel invisible. I unpacked slowly, taking my time. There was no rush. Each item I placed, my favorite chipped mug, the quilt from my wedding year, a stack of paperbacks, felt like a deliberate claim over my space. The air here was different, lighter, as though it didn't remember all the arguments, the silences, the stares that had filled the old house. Within a week, the Margaret Lewis Foundation for Transitional Housing was officially active. Clara and I met at the small office we'd rented in town, going over the first applications. Women from all walks of life, retired teachers, widows, even a former librarian, had been referred to us by social services, all with one thing in common. They'd been displaced, sometimes by family, sometimes by financial loss, often by both. Our first placement was a woman named Margaret, though she preferred to go by Mags to avoid confusion. She was 72, her hands knotted from years of factory work, her eyes sharp but tired. Her son had sold her condo without telling her, moving her into a spare room in his house, only to suggest she might be more comfortable elsewhere after a few months. The pain in her voice was too familiar. When we handed her the keys to her own small unit, she clutched them like they were made of gold. The second was Gloria, 65, a former nurse who'd been evicted after her landlord decided to renovate and double the rent. She'd been living in her car for weeks before a local church connected her to us. The first night she stayed in the Foundation's transitional housing, she sent us a handwritten note. "It feels good to sleep without wondering if someone will knock on my window." Those stories filled me with a quiet satisfaction. I wasn't naive enough to think we could fix every injustice, but every time I saw a woman walk into a space where she could close the door and lock it from the inside, I felt something in my chest loosen. One morning, after returning from a grocery run, I found a plain envelope in my cottage mailbox. No return address. The handwriting stopped me cold. It was Ethan's. I carried it inside, setting the bag of apples and bread on the counter before tearing it open. It wasn't a long letter, just a few paragraphs. He said he was sorry for letting things get so far, for not protecting me when I needed him to, for choosing convenience over conscience. He admitted that he'd believed Laura when she said it was for the best, and that it took losing me entirely to realize how much of himself he'd lost in the process. He didn't ask for forgiveness outright, but the weight of the words made it clear he wanted it. I sat with that letter for hours, the paper softening under my fingertips. I thought about the boy who used to leave me notes on the fridge asking for lunch money, the man who had stood by silent while his wife dismantled my life, and the stranger who had quietly taken from me without my consent. I didn't know if those three people were separate or the same. By late afternoon, I placed the letter in the back of my desk drawer, next to Henry's old watch and the cinnamon roll recipe. I didn't throw it away, but I didn't respond either. That evening, Clara stopped by with paperwork for our next expansion. There was an old roadside motel on the edge of town, nothing glamorous but solid in structure, that had just gone on the market. If we bought it, renovated it, we could house at least a dozen more women. "You've got the budget for it," Clara said, sliding the estimates toward me, "and frankly, the demand is already more than we can meet." We sat at my small kitchen table, sipping tea as we discussed the logistics. It felt good to talk about building something instead of fighting to keep something from being taken. When she left, the cottage was quiet again, but it wasn't the oppressive quiet of the old house. This was the kind of quiet that came from safety. Before bed, I stepped out onto the porch. The moon was low, casting silver light across the tree line. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. I wrapped Henry's old blue shawl around my shoulders and breathed in the cool night air. The road that had brought me here had been cruel, jagged, and full of turns I hadn't chosen, but it had also led me to a place where I could do more than just survive. I was living again. And in the stillness of that moment, I realized I had no need to return to what was. The future, for once, didn't feel like something to brace for. It felt like something to step into. The morning sun spilled gently through the kitchen window, warming the worn wooden table where my tea steamed in a chipped mug. I sat wrapped in Henry's old blue shawl, savoring the quiet. On the table beside me was a small stack of mail. Most of it was routine, bills, flyers, but one envelope stood out, addressed in careful, looping handwriting. I opened it to find a handwritten letter from Gloria, one of the first women our foundation had placed in transitional housing. Her words spilled across the page, unpolished but heartfelt. "I never thought I'd sleep in a bed I could call mine again. I never thought I'd feel safe enough to leave my purse in another room. You gave me back more than a roof. You gave me back the right to breathe without fear. Thank you, from the deepest part of me." I read it twice. the corners of my mouth lifting in a quiet smile. It was a reminder that the fights we choose can ripple far beyond the moment we win them. The kettle clicked softly as it cooled. I leaned back in my chair, letting the stillness settle over me like a second skin. For the first time in years, my life wasn't defined by what I'd lost, but by what I was building. Then, 3 sharp knocks at the door. I rose slowly, a flicker of unease crossing my mind. When I opened it, there he was, Ethan. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him, though it hadn't been that long. His eyes were shadowed, his posture slouched, as if the weight he carried wasn't just physical. We stood there for a moment, the space between us heavy with unspoken history. "I was in the area," he said finally. His voice was low, careful. "I thought, maybe." He trailed off, then tried again. "I just wanted to say..." He stopped, jaw tightening. "I wish things had gone differently. Not, I'm sorry. Not I was wrong. Just that." I studied his face for a long moment, searching for the boy I'd raised, for the man I'd once believed would protect me. If he was there, he was buried deep. My smile was small but steady. "We all make our choices, Ethan." He shifted on his feet as though waiting for me to invite him in. I didn't. Instead, I said, "Take care of yourself," and closed the door gently, not with anger, but with certainty. The silence that followed was warm, final. Later that afternoon, Clara drove me to the old roadside motel we'd just acquired for the foundation. From the outside, it still wore the tired face of years gone by. Faded paint, rusting railings, a cracked sign that once promised clean rooms, low rates. But I could already see what it would become. We walked the narrow hallways, stepping into rooms that would soon be filled with beds, lamps, and the quiet dignity of a locked door. In one suite, sunlight poured through a window overlooking a small garden plot that had gone wild with weeds. I pictured it cleared, planted with herbs and flowers, a space for someone to tend and call their own. Clara talked about permits, timelines, budgets, but I found myself tuning out. My mind was on the women who would live here, each carrying their own story of loss and survival. They would arrive with more questions than answers, more scars than belongings. But they would arrive. I stepped outside into the courtyard, breathing in the cool air. The wind moved through the empty space, carrying away the dust of what had been. And in that moment, standing before a building that would soon shelter dozens of women, I understood something with a clarity that cut clean through me. Strength isn't in clutching the past, no matter how tightly you've held it. It's in releasing it, in stepping forward even when you don't know exactly where the path will lead. I had let go, and in doing so, I had made room for something far greater. The motel wasn't just a project. It was proof that my story didn't end when I lost the house. It began the moment I walked away from it.